clinic or webinar about managing virtual projects in a time of coronavirus. We have a group of people who are managing the Teams Thursday New England event, which was supposed to happen on April 2nd. And of course, we postponed that to June 3rd. But we wanted to be able to offer some webinars along the way, some online events that would allow people to talk about some of the same topics that we would approach at Teams Thursday, but from a different perspective. We have a situation going on now that makes us all think about work a bit differently, and so we wanted to take some looks at different angles of the way we need to do our virtual work these days. Chris, could you go to the next slide? Thank you. So I think we're all learning that things are different and that things may continue to change and may change for the foreseeable future. The quote on the left is something that I spotted in a newsletter that Heather Cox Richardson puts out every day about sort of how the news stacks up against her historical perspective. She's a historian. You know, we're in a time where you know, we're all maybe a little bit skittish, a little bit scared, a little bit trying to figure out how we're balancing the things that we normally would do at work with working from home or other isolated locations, how we interact with our families, how we interact with our co-workers, how we think about what's happening from a more global perspective. This is something that's affecting everyone across the entire globe, not just somebody in our city or in our region. So again, we thought we would start this series of webinars, and if you know we come up with other topics, we'll extend these, especially if this crisis goes on for a long time. We have this one today, managing virtual projects in the time of coronavirus. On April 6th, which is a Monday, we'll have managing virtual events in a time of coronavirus. And then on April 16th, which is another Thursday, we'll have managing virtual brainstorming, innovation processes, and decision making. So all of that will hopefully lead up to the Teams Thursday event on June 3rd, which is historically a live, well, this is our first one, but that's the kind of event that we're doing is a live event where it's in the same place and we can, you know, collaborate and work through some of these thoughts even further on that day. We're aiming for June 3rd and keeping our fingers crossed. So just a couple of tips. If you haven't used a Teams meeting before, just a few things that we find that can be very interesting. There's a toolbar that brown sort of dark gray toolbar that I have an image of up at the top. If you hover over the middle bottom of your screen, you should see that toolbar, and you notice there's a little camera icon. The one in that screenshot is off, and then there's a microphone icon, and that one is on. So those are two controls that you can use to either show your video or say something if you need to. Chris is going to make sure that we try to keep people muted who aren't talking. And then the other important one is the one with the little red dot on it. That's the chat. And if you click on that, you'll see the chat off to the right. If you have any feedback, be sure to type it in that chat. We'll keep an eye on that. You know, don't do the +1 and things like that. There's actually a little thumbs up that you can use on top of people's comments if you want to sort of say, yeah, that's a good one. If you'd like to say something, there's a tip there. If you type the win key and the dot and type raised hand, you can put that in as a chat post, and then we'll know that you want to actually say something, and we'll keep track of that. And I've got a list that I'll add you to, and we'll make sure that we try to get to everyone who asks to talk. So that's the housekeeping. Let's jump a little further into who we are and why we're here. I think I'll do this just really quickly because I've already wasted too much time. We have 4 people on as presenters today. Katrina Pugh, who's on the faculty at Columbia University and focuses on designing productive and innovative collaborations. She's the one in the middle with the koala bear. We have Marianne Snow on the right with the rabbit ears. And she is the CEO, founder, and founder at Sophia and Remote Nation. And she's all about remote work and helping people figure out that strategy. Remote work is not a new thing. It's just that we're forced into it for different reasons at this point. Chris Bortlick is at Microsoft. He's on the left side of my screen. He's at Microsoft. He's the principal technical architect. Work with him on all kinds of things. He focuses on their global customers and their Microsoft 365 collaboration and security strategy. And then I'm Mark Anderson. I'm the president of Subraxis Consulting, which is based in the Boston area. And we really, we are a small consulting company of 6 people who always work from home. So, the way we run our company and the way we work with our clients is essentially remote work every day, 24/7 almost. And so that's the perspective that I bring to the table. So I'm done. Hand it over to Chris.
All right, awesome. Thanks, Mark. So yeah, as Mark mentioned, my name is Chris Bortlick. I'm one of the principal architects at the Microsoft Technology Center in Boston. We just wanted to spend a few minutes first off thanking you all again for making the time to join us today. And really just wanted to share some quick statistics that Jared Spataro, who's one of the corporate vice presidents on the Microsoft 365 team, shared last week. We appreciate that many of us are working from home more than often, sometimes for the first time. And we've seen that on our service, Microsoft 365, which Microsoft Teams is part of. We've seen some significant growth in usage of the platform. We're very fortunate that our platform has scaled based on the global footprint of the Microsoft Azure cloud that Teams is built on top of. And in fact, just last week, Jared put out a blog post talking about how just in 7 days, we went from having 44 million daily active users of Microsoft 365, and that was grown 12 million in just the past 7 days. So we went from 32 to 44 million in about a week. And we're really proud of the work we're doing with Teams across the global Fortune 100. 650 companies are trusting Microsoft Teams for over 10,000 people using the platform on a regular basis. And we're in 181 different markets. We know many of you are joining this from around the world. And Teams supports not just the English language, but 53 languages globally. So really appreciate certainly the work that the product teams are doing to keep Teams up and running and keep it to a stable platform globally. But also the fact that a lot of you are just learning to use Teams or using Teams a bit more than you might have done in the past. So with that, I'm going to flip things over to Marianne and Kate, who will talk about some of the collaboration challenges that we're seeing.
So I'm going to jump in. This is Marianne. Thanks so much for coming today. And what a couple of weeks it's been. I know that in my business, because we work with our technology partners, but we focus on actually creating the organizational processes and implementing remote work programs, work from home programs, flexible work programs within companies. And we help them with everything from how do you set up policies and what kind of tools do you use and how do you get your people trained. And in this particular climate, what we've experienced is that suddenly you have non-traditional organizations that have had emergency shutdowns, and suddenly you have traditional office workers who've been forced into a work from home environment who are very much at a loss right now. There's a lot of chaos out there. And so we're getting a lot of phone calls from people who are struggling to be able to really adapt to this new situation, figure out a way forward. And picking a tool is really important, but we also say you really have to think about how people are going to interact, because good collaboration is harder than you think, even in the best of circumstances. It doesn't matter if you're virtual or not. Folks that are co-located, people that are co-located, can find it very, very hard to collaborate with each other for lots of different reasons. And part of it is because we as humans, we're pretty messy. We're emotional. We tend to really kind of focus on our own perspectives. We have our own biases. And as humans, even if we're sitting in the same conference room, we're going to find out that people may or may not agree with us, and they may be on board with our suggestions, or they might not be on board with our suggestions. So coming into a virtual collaboration situation and a remote project management situation is no different than doing it in a co-located situation. It's not necessarily harder, but you have the same constraints. You're still dealing with people, and people are messy. That means that folks who are in these new environments have to take new approaches. You have to have a new mindset, because how you interact, there's a new set of indicators, there's a new set of skills that are required. And regardless of the tools, it's generally the people that either make it up or make it work or screw it up along the way, depending on their willingness to be able to function effectively in these environments. So Kate, anything you want to add before we move on to the next slide?
No, that was beautiful. I would only add the compounding piece for many of us is that we're all with our families competing for bandwidth. And I was going to say, it's not only people that will screw it up. You can see me turning my head. I've got two little felines right here who may walk across this keyboard. So back over to you, Chris.
Great. So I just, wanted to share with you briefly some of the survey results. So we appreciate that many of you took the time before the webinar series, the clinic that we're running, to give us some of your thoughts and your perspective. So we briefly wanted to share some of the feedback that you've all provided us. And this poll will be open for a while, as Mark mentioned at the start. This is the first in a series of clinics we'll be running. And we posed 3 questions to you all. And we're reviewing the results together earlier. And really this validates a lot of our understanding and our assumptions. So the first question we asked was, what is your biggest worry after certainly the health and well-being of your families, friends, clients, and colleagues? And no surprise that most people felt that they have a concern about their projects, their work being postponed or canceled. I know that's a big thing that's a concern for many of us. A lot of folks are dealing with the fact that they're working remotely. For some people, this is the first time they've had to work remotely. For some of us,
Chris, could I just pause you right there and just have you refresh the page? Because we actually have a bunch of new responses since you put it up there.
Oh, great.
Sorry.
No, that's all good. We were at 29, about half an hour ago. Yeah. Let me just do that real quick. So we're now up to 35, which is great. So thank you, Mark.
Sorry about that.
No, it's all good. That was about an hour ago. We were at 29. So similar statistics there, though. Even with the additional votes, which is great. So about 16 people were worried about projects being postponed or canceled. A number of folks are concerned about their team working remote. And again, for some folks, they're used to working remote, but they may now be not used to having the entire team being remote. I know it's a big shift Microsoft's going through, especially out in our corporate Redmond campus, where folks were used to being together physically co-located on the campus, and now they're working together across the globe. And then other things are around just making sure we're prioritizing it in clear direction from our leadership and the people we work with. A lot of folks have concerns around virtual events. And again, all of us that are on the call that are facilitating this, we're used to presenting as part of virtual events, in-person events like Teams Thursday, like the SharePoint conference and Ignite and other big technical conferences. But for a lot of folks, they might not be used to this. We're seeing a lot, certainly at home. I know my daughters, they're dance studio teachers, they're teachers in their classrooms. They're learning how to present and share content of virtual events. And Marianne was mentioning a similar thing going on with one of her friends. So for a lot of folks, this is brand new to them, try to run these virtual classes and virtual events. And one of the things that concerns people is, how do they get their technology set up appropriately? And how do they continue to engage people like we're trying to do? One of the great things rolling out into Teams soon is the ability to actually have the ability to raise your hand as part of the meeting. So I know Mark talked about some of the things you can do today to kind of work around that, but having that ability to engage with the audience and ask questions and engage with them on an ongoing basis. And then lastly, if you think about as we work together in teams, think about how we actually planned and worked on this webinar together. We spent a lot of time using Teams to present and work together. And we used quite heavily the ability to collaborate on a shared whiteboard, shared notes, shared documents. This presentation was co-authored in place. We're using OneNote to take notes throughout the process. But we also are using task lists like Microsoft Planner to keep us on task with making sure we know who's doing what and when. And then we certainly are doing things like liking on posts, moderating Q&A, and again, a lot of the things that we're using within this platform. So again, we really appreciate, I know about 35 of you so the opportunity to post and give us your feedback. certainly continue to give us that feedback, and it's going to guide what we do in the next two webinars as part of the ongoing clinic series. So with that, I'm going to go back to the slides and hand this over to Marianne and Kate to talk about virtual work.
So I'm going to kick off this section. This is Marianne again. And Chris, if you flip to the next slide, we're going to talk about two types of virtual work. And the first type of virtual work is sort of the normal virtual work, right? If you're going remote for any reason. And when we think about remote, we not only think about virtual teams in relation to people who are all sitting at different locations, but we also think about just dispersed teams in general, where you might have lots of people. They might be sitting in offices, but they're not geographically co-located. But you also have now a situation where you've got people pretty much working from anywhere. A good portion of the world is working from unfinished basements, or their kitchen table, their couches, their dining room areas, wherever their rest of their family isn't. And so the normal circumstances when you go virtual, the first thing that you're really dealing with is the fact that you're out of sight. And that means that there's a certain anxiety level, because now you're saying to yourself, geez, if I have remote workers, can I trust that those people are doing what they're supposed to be? I can't see them. Are they actually doing the work that they're supposed to be doing? And if you're working with individuals that you don't know very well, you might be saying to yourself, can I depend on them to meet their obligations and do the work that they have committed to? Because if they don't, then this is going to put me in a difficult position. Now, the other thing that's happening in these circumstances, if you're not utilizing tools like Teams, where there's some sort of a virtual connection, you obviously learn the body language. And so when you're either going to a strict audio environment, or if you're going to a strict digital environment where you're working strictly from text, then we've lost body language. We've lost all sorts of the nuances that come with any sort of communication, and a good deal of our ability to remember that the people that we're working with are human goes away. We start to think of ourselves as the only person in the room sometimes. And so whether it's miscommunication, whether it's mistrust, whether it's ability to stay unified and connected. And so the more that we can look at these environments and look for ways to put humanity back into the circumstance, and whether that's through a video conferencing venues and moving into that video realm, whether it's learning how to indicate the nonverbal indicators in audio conferencing, whether it's using emojis even in highly organized business environments, or those sorts of things. But how do we continue to infuse virtual work and remote work with that human element, so we're reminded that regardless of whether we're sitting in the same room or we're in a virtual space, we're all in it together, and we're all people. Chris, can you go to the next slide? So one of the things that we talk a lot about is, when you're bringing virtual project teams together, and whether this is an actual project team that will be implementing a project within an organization, whether we're talking about something broadly where in this day and age, because of the circumstance, we're actually have whole companies going virtual. And how do you bring people together? How do you get them working in the same direction? How do you create very transparent plans for staying connected? and pulling people together so that we can work virtually in an appropriate way. And we're finding at this particular moment in time, in a normal circumstance, you'd actually think about these things ahead of time. And you can't really do that right now, because if people are coming into these environments quite unexpectedly, and suddenly they're finding that they have all of their colleagues going remote, and this has never happened before, then you really have to take this out of a normal process, which is a little more thoughtful, and put it into more of a crisis process, and really come up with that operating model. Who's going to do what? Where is information going to come from? When are we going to do things? What are we going to use for tools? And there has to be something that is going to happen very, very fast. It's got to be intentional. It's got to be measured. You're going to have to make some adjustments, but in these environments, it's got to be crisply and very coherently communicated to the people on your team. And then you can think about the next steps, which is now how do you get everybody up to speed, not only on the process, but whatever technical tools that you're looking for. At this point, I'm going to turn it over to Kate, because obviously there are people involved here, and people are kind of freaked right now. They are feeling chaotic. They're feeling isolated. And so Kate's going to talk a little bit about how do you create that psychological safety.
Thank you, Marianne. That was a really great introduction. And what we need to do is create some of the patterns and conditions and interactions that enable people to build relationships and build trust. And there is quite a bit of interesting research on the connection between psychological safety and trust. And the trust research shows that teams and organizations that have higher trust have about 106% more energy. And they also have about 76% more engagement. I thought this is pretty stunning. This research comes from a study done by Paul Zak, who has done a lot of research at Harvard. It was a Harvard Business School study. And what he did was he looked at the actual oxytocin in people's brains, and he measured that, and then he controlled for other factors like tenure, like place in the hierarchy, like economic status of the organization, even industry. And it was pretty remarkable to see that where he could measure trust quantitatively and biologically, he was able to see these things. He also found that organizations that have higher trust have 50% higher productivity. These are numbers that probably we should all be listening to, because what we need to do is use what's left when we don't have all of the senses that are available to us. We don't have all the water coolers. We don't have all the parking lots. So these are some of the tips that this group of 4 came up with. And we really encourage you guys to share other ways where you create trust. So one is use more. That might mean you use a little bit more video. It might mean you make a little bit more personal calls. It may mean you need to make sure that you put extra time into hearing what people are concerned about. You may need to repeat a little bit. You know there's lots of distractions. If I'm doing my work from my machine and I've got my cat crawling across my keyboard and I've got my kids competing for Wi-Fi, and if I'm in the basement with the spiders, then there are other distractions. I don't have the luxury of being in an elegant conference room away from my family or my home. You also need to be very, very intentional about participation. We put up there turn taking. There is really fascinating research by Sandy Pentland at MIT that shows that groups that come together, ideally in some kind of rich communication format, are far more effective. But he also learned in that research that the more effective groups, the ones that created more psychological safety, were the ones where there was equity in terms of engagement. And there also was more diverse interactions. It wasn't just simply the project manager interacting with the project members. Also, create opportunities for your teams to take some risks. Take baby steps. It might be a joke of the day when you're bringing people together, or you might do some things interesting with the projects themselves. Those kinds of risks taken lightly and with some recovery means many people learn together. That improves psychological safety as well. Follow through. If you as a leader say, we're going to be meeting at this time, and you just discover that you've got other things competing for time and you don't follow through, you're going to put people at risk. You're going to put the trust at risk. Acknowledge that there is a fear of missing out. Marianne said this brilliantly. You're alone. So frequently when you're interacting on a virtual team, you don't know what kinds of decisions are being made. If somebody has historically moved out of Teams or moved out of your collaboration tool and they've interacted in other formats to make decisions or to interact, you may not be present. And as a leader of a virtual interaction, think about that. Respect the forum. Be humble, be accessible. I mentioned to you that we don't have a water cooler, we don't have a parking lot. If you're the leader of an organization and you're perhaps several hierarchical levels above some of the people that are literally on your team, make yourself available to them because there could be some insights or fears that you may be missing. I know that in my life, I spent the last 20 years working virtual off and on. I would not make that additional call, say, to Mark, because Mark was in a place that was more high in the hierarchy. And I was fearful because I didn't want to make Chris angry because Chris was my boss. So I didn't make the call, which meant that there might be something that slipped or there might be something that I knew could be a potential outcome. I didn't have time to talk to Chris about it, but I knew it was something that was really interesting to Mark, but I didn't bring it up because I felt like I was violating some kind of code of conduct. As a leader, you can do things about that. Hold a regular check-in. One of the things that I did with my faculty when I was at Columbia, for 5.5 years, I was the academic director for a program where all of my faculty were virtual. They were all over the country. Every month, we did a round robin, and we just found out what people were doing. We found out what their research was. We found out what their consulting projects were. It built an immense amount of rapport. And with that psychological safety, faculty cared about each other. They thought about each other. When they came up with a new idea or an innovation or a piece of research, they brought it to each other's attention because they were carrying them, their peers, in their minds as they proceeded. So those are the kind of fundamental things you will be thinking about. Even though you'll be blocking and tackling, you'll get people into meetings, you'll be thinking about how to get work done. You'll also be considering how you're going to be able to create psychological safety. All right, so why don't we move on to virtual meetings?
Great. So, Kate, do you want to talk through some of the numbers? Yeah.
Yeah, why don't I just start with this one, Chris, and then we'll move right on. So this is a slide that Chris and I created together, so I hope they're going to come off mute. We were really just astounded at some of the magnitudes in starting with the slide that Chris shared earlier, the numbers of people who are now going online. But we also were astounded with the numbers of things that really should be on our minds as we are leading virtual work. So I like just simply the fact that 10,000 people can be present in a single Microsoft 365 Live event. Keep that in mind because in our third clinic, we're going to be talking about events. And you may find that you're going to be helping some of your colleagues run their gigantic, chemical society meetings. Also, research done by Intel almost 10 years ago, so this may be a very conservative number, showed that the average employee who is a knowledge worker spends 500 hours a year in meetings. Those meetings are going to be going virtual. You need to be able to think about the quality of life and the quality of interaction. Productivity is absolutely critical. Those can't be wasted hours. 250 participants are possible within a single Teams meeting. So today we had capacity for 250. So invite your friends to the next two. On average, you should be spending no more than 45 minutes in your agenda for your 1-hour meeting. Know that you should be spending other minutes in the meeting getting people to be comfortable with each other. Build that psychological safety. And also know that for a while you will find issues where people are having trouble getting online. We'll just go through these next ones. There are tons of tools out there. Make sure that your team knows which ones you're using, particularly when it pertains to sharing documents. There's nothing worse than somebody saying, hey, gang, look, I shared it on a Google Doc. And then Chris says, Kate, I work for Microsoft. What are you talking about? He's laughing.
Hypothetically, right?
This is a true story. Hey, Chris, let's have a Zoom meeting. I got a really good kick out of that. And then last but not least, you should recognize that you have one body. And even while you are spending your time sitting right now among your good friends, get out into the sunshine, get out into the rain, get yourself moving, take care of your back, take care of your feet, take care of your patients. All of those are going to be under pressure. Back to you, Chris.
Thanks. Yeah. And just, on the physical body, I was mentioning a few folks in Microsoft today. My children, you might have seen the photo of my wife and our 4 daughters. They were in school, and their school system just shared a document with the parents today around mindfulness for children, and how even students need to be mindful, need to make sure they're taking care of themselves. So again, a lot of these lessons don't just apply to us in corporate America, as well as around the world. It also applies to our families, our spouses, our children, our parents, everyone else that's dealing with this crisis right now. So as we think about the types of events that we see, Kate did a great job summarizing, some of the technical parts of the platform. So certainly, Satya Nadella, Microsoft CEO, he and some of our leaders like Amy Hood, our CFO, like Brad Smith, our Chief Legal Officer and President, they run a monthly town hall meeting we call the CEO Connection. And they just did one last week where we talked globally across Microsoft with up to 10,000 people on how does Microsoft support this challenge, support what's going on. How do we think about it with inside of Microsoft? How do we think about supporting our customers, our partners, our spouses, our community? So that's a great example around a one-to-many type format where maybe the purpose of that is to communicate news or events. Oftentimes those live events could be used to communicate status. What are we doing around a large program? But I actually had a conversation last week with the city of Woburn, which is where I reside, where we're actually looking at leveraging Microsoft Live events to allow our mayor within the town of Woburn to actually communicate with the constituents because they can't go into City Hall and actually have a discussion. How do we actually use these things to share policy updates with our stakeholders in our communities? How do we deal with crisis response? There's a number of resources we're going to be sharing after this. Microsoft has built some tools and solutions that are built on top of Microsoft Teams and SharePoint and Yammer to help with dealing around crisis management. We built a Power Platform solution that we've open sourced to help people dealing with crisis response, not just related to the coronavirus and COVID-19, but any crisis. This will pass, like all other major crises have. How do we use this to build some of the programs and some of the muscles that are going to survive us beyond this crisis? Which gets into running the operation. Certainly when we're running operation, we could be doing things one-to-one. So quite often we'll have a private one-to-one chat. So as an example, Mark and I might have a back channel. We were working on some technology issues last week that didn't really, involve the broader team. We had a private one-to-one chat. We often will have a one-to-few. So we have a private one-to-few back channel that's going on amongst the 4 presenters right now where the 4 of us can be collaborating and having discussions. So using that to actually run the ongoing operations. Again, leveraging Teams in these live events and other parts of the platform like Yammer to help people with understanding and interpreting the change. A lot of change management goes on in these large events. Many of us, as Marianne mentioned, are being forced into work from home. And I had a conversation yesterday with a large financial services customer where they don't see this as a temporary shift. People have finally, I think, been pushed into the whole work from home and remote work and flexible work styles and work-life balance, whatever that means, because we're always on and always connected. But how do we, even after this is done in a couple of weeks or a couple of months or whatever, this is going to be the new normal for many folks that have said, look, maybe we can work on a development team in a decentralized fashion across the world. Maybe we don't have to have people in the office every day. Maybe we're actually a little more productive sometimes when we're working remote and people aren't just stopping by our office to interrupt us. So how do we actually think about this as not just a one-time event? And then designing the process around the product, the operation. As folks mentioned, it's not just the technology, it's the people and the process and the culture that go into this as well.
Yeah, and Chris,
yeah.
I'm going to just jump into that because I want to riff off of what Chris is talking about in terms of, is this going to be a temporary change, or is this going to be something that is a little more permanent? And what's really interesting in my world right now when I'm talking to my clients is it's making major shifts in all sorts of industries. So suddenly you have insurance industries that are willing to pay for telemedicine visits where that wasn't possible before. You have education folks that have dabbled in online and really done online in terms of as more as of an asynchronous solution. And now you have people moving wholesale online for entire semester classes. You have major organizational structures that now have to manage not only crisis response, but they still have to stay connected to their customers and their clients. And they're finding out that they can not only save money by having virtual connection points instead of having to get on a plane and physically be present, but you also have a circumstance where people have the structural components now in place to be able to run remote work programs in the event that there is some sort of a weather concern, or there's other particular regional concerns that might get in the way of having somebody come to a physical office. So I've already got clients who are saying to themselves, should we really maintain satellite offices the way we have in the past and pay that rent, or do we save that money and get people into more work from home situations?
Yeah, and a great example to build on that, the Jared Spataro put out in a blog post last week is one of our local customers in New England, Nuance Communications, actually had a large inside the company event that couldn't be held in person. I think up in Canada is where they run it, and they had to run it 100% virtual. And they had a transition in about a week or so to do that. And they realized, one, they could run the event. It wasn't the same because there's still a need to get people physically together and have some of those things that we're missing, although we're doing a lot of virtual happy hours and other things to kind of mitigate some of that. But what they found is they actually saved a ton of money by moving the event to online, and it's actually helping them with reducing their carbon footprint as well. So, Microsoft and Nuance and a lot of other companies are trying to be more responsible with the environment and looking at remote meetings to cut down on not just cost, but as Marianne mentioned, some of the travel impact and other things that, again, are things that we can help to improve our planet for everyone. So as we talk about the virtual meeting basics, I'm not going to go through these all. And really, as we worked on this together as a team, we really looked at this sequentially as how you might prepare for the meeting. So certainly, a lot of these are honestly common sense. I think most of us have grown up with, although we need a refresher as we move into an online world, that making sure we're sharing an agenda in advance, ideally put that agenda on a shared site like a Team or a SharePoint or a OneDrive and not send it as an attachment. So as the meeting's being updated, as notes are being done, they're all being done in a central location and there's one single copy, one version of the truth. You're having people that are assigned to different roles like we're doing here, where we're taking turns having people being scribes and managing who's coming into the meeting and assigning different roles. So as we're doing this meeting, the four of us are set up as presenters and all of you are set up as attendees. So we as presenters have different roles and permissions in the meeting than you may have as an attendee. You might have noticed that this meeting is set up that you can join via Teams in a web browser, on Windows, on Mac, on an iPhone, on an Android device, on a Linux client. But we also provided a dial-in number. Some people might be mobile. They might be driving somewhere for an appointment or go to the grocery store or whatever other limited places we can travel to these days in our cars, and they need a dial-in number. Or they might be somewhere with poor bandwidth because their kids are playing a lot of Xbox games and sucking up all the bandwidth, and we need to dial in via phone to actually listen into that. Actively moderate the meeting in terms of question and answer. Try to start and end on time. And again, one of the things beyond what Kate mentioned around not packing the agenda too much, trying to end meetings 5 or 10 minutes early. One of the things we've learned in Microsoft is that when you're in person, there are natural buffers that are built in to go from room to room or building to building that might not be there when you're stacking your day with back-to-back meetings. So I always try to build in a half an hour buffer before a meeting and after a meeting to have time to review my notes, use the restroom, grab a drink, check in on the kids, whatever, things that we need to do in a virtual environment so our calendar isn't filled up with back-to-back that call. As much as you can, use an appropriate headset. If you need to, be wired, although knock on wood, I'm running on my Wi-Fi connection here and things have been solid and Teams is built to be more resilient. But again, certainly if you have concerns about bandwidth and saturation, having a wired connection, but certainly having a headset. So you're not, yelling through your mic and your speaker on your laptop, or you're not having a lot of background noise. And Teams, as you've noticed, has the ability to background blur your image, as Mark and Kate are doing. Or I dropped an image behind me, trying to remember what it was like being back in Hawaii when I could travel last year with my wife and our kids and trying to have that tropical feel. But again, having the ability to certainly blur and black out your screen. But even as Microsoft announced last week, we're adding soon the ability to have background noise cancellation as well. So if you're in a meeting and the cats and the dogs and the kids are making noise and you're at a construction site and there's jackhammers going on, you can actually focus on the active speaker and not worry about needing to have a noise canceling headset or noise canceling microphone as well. Share your screen as we're doing, and again, making sure you're taking note of things like the red bar that goes around your screen to know that the screen is being shared and the right content's being shared. Turning on your video is huge. We're finding this inside of Microsoft, doing one-on-ones with our managers, having video on. As you're seeing here with us, having these 4 videos up. We are working on adding additional ability to do a 3x3 to have 9 video streams. But there is some science on how many video screens you want to actually have up, just from a perspective how much we can understand as humans, how much we can process, as well as how much bandwidth can be actually consumed by the meeting. Continue to take notes. So within the meeting, we're all keeping notes collaboratively inside of a OneNote. We worked a lot in Word, in the wiki inside of Teams. We're also leveraging things like Microsoft Whiteboard across platform to allow for digital note-taking and inking using your finger, using your mouse, using a pen. And that works, again, cross-platform, different browsers, on Windows, on iOS devices, to really allow us to all get together virtually and work together on a whiteboard. A lot of development teams, a lot of folks that are used to walking up to a whiteboard and just grabbing a marker and writing on it are leveraging the digital whiteboard capabilities. At the end of the meetings, make sure we're summarizing who owns what. If you need to put those tasks on something like Microsoft Planner, so there's clear responsibility on who owns what, when it's due, getting reminders and email notifications, checking in on the status, making sure we're managing the assignments across the meeting, and then just agreeing as a team what things will still be done in email, such as client communications, things outside of the organization, versus what things should be done inside of the team chat or should be done in private chat. So again, having some rules of the road, as well as just the common things that from class perspective. Again, common sense, I like to say, common things that we do in person, we need to continue to do in an online forum. So not just hiding behind the mouse and the keyboard, just like you wouldn't hopefully do that on social media outside the company, making sure you're leveraging tools appropriately, that we're giving people a chance to have a voice, and recognizing that not everyone may feel as comfortable with putting something out in Teams or Yammer or something else in writing. They might be a bit more reserved. You might have to reach out to them one-on-one in a private chat and say, hey, Mark, I noticed you haven't been as active out there. Is there something you want to share? Or because maybe Mark doesn't feel comfortable putting that question out in a public forum. Not that Mark has ever been known to be shy or myself like that, but just making sure we're being empathetic and understanding that not everyone is used to or as comfortable putting their name and their thoughts out in a public forum, even if it's a small group of people inside of a team.
Yeah, and I'm also going to add the fact that right at this particular point in time, we have an unprecedented situation where with emergency workplace shutdowns, all sorts of people are now coming into virtual meetings who never would have thought about that before. And so they're getting forced into these environments, and it can be quite chaotic if you're not doing the preparation ahead of time. Virtual meetings particularly really benefit from proactive planning. They benefit from having active moderation. And there's also got to be a little bit of really stating the rules up front, because you've got folks coming into these forums who have actually never done this before. So having the patience, talking to people up front about what the rules of the road are, and indicating how they can participate and then we're finding that in these forums, making sure that you're inviting people in using their names, inviting people to step back. So again, you can highlight the humanity and you're allowing people to be able to participate without talking over each other, which is another major piece, and really presents things in an orderly and a calm and focused fashion.
So with that, I'm going to hand things over, I think, to Mark and Kate to kind of talk about virtual projects.
Thank you. Fantastic. So, Mark, you and I can kind of flow through this. I'm going to be very quick because what I really want to do is to give the time back over to you guys who are participating with us. Marianne said it brilliantly. Plan, plan, plan. Plan for equity, plan for organization, plan for recognizing other people's constraints, and really think about how you are going to create a closed loop. So if you're going to be saying something in a meeting around an assignment or an outcome or a scope, you need to be very, very careful that you monitor that and take it forward. It's because every one of us is going to be incredibly distracted. We've got a lot of other things going on. And each time we engage, we're going to be engaging in this format. And it's very possible that we're not going to be able to remember things from place to place. Let's look at the next slide. So we're not going to go through these, but just as you did organize each of your virtual meeting, you're going to be thinking at a more macro level about organizing your virtual project. So you will have different types of protocols, how people are going to be updating their statuses. Make sure that everybody understands what success means. Success for your project may have been defined long ago before you went into a fully virtual environment. There may be another thing they're going to put out there is, how are we going to be successful as a highly effective team? You also want to make sure, going back to that theme of psychological safety, that you've put into place ways that people can interact and share their concerns and feel safe that they can say things that may be uncomfortable. There should be ways that they can save face. Let's look at the next slide. So one key thing with our teams, particularly teams where we have people who don't live within the same hierarchy, is that we need to have ways to get ideas out and to vote. I'm not going to go into detail because this is the subject of our third clinic, but there needs to be a little bit out here now because we are talking about virtual projects. Think about ways that you're going to be making decisions. Frequently, you're going to have a question like we had earlier. I wrote a note saying, guys, what should we do about acronyms? I changed SME to subject matter expert. You know, depending on who you are, that could mean small and medium enterprises. And I saw a note coming back from Mark saying, yeah, I agree. I think that, you know, the acronyms are a scourge on the earth, although you said something probably more poignant than that. So we did have some questions that we aired in our chat. Because there's only 4 of us, we were able to kind of very, very quickly vet a number of different ideas. However, as a group, you may choose to do something that is a little bit more formal. You may say when you come into a meeting, I need to make a decision. This is going to be a consultative decision, or this is going to be a consensus decision, or this is going to be a majority rules. Be very clear on what's going to happen. And it may be that every single meeting will have some flavor of decision. Clearly state when the discussion is taking place, when the decision is going to be made. Because what you don't want to have happen is that people pretend that the decision wasn't made, either because they weren't there or because they didn't agree and they didn't have an opportunity to air their concerns. When I was at Intel, we had this model called disagree and commit. That meant that after we'd made the vote and everybody had an opportunity to describe what they thought probably was the course of action, would have been preferable for them, they went around the room and they said, I agree and I commit. I agree and I commit. Or they might say, I disagree and I commit, but we could hold them to it because even though maybe I didn't have my ideas come to the top when we voted, doesn't mean that when I proceed into action that I'm going to still be sort of moving around the edges and refusing to commit. Mark, do you want to add to this one?
No, I think, yep, I'm not muted. That's one of those virtual meeting things. Always make sure you know if your microphone's on. I think that you often have to just take a little bit more care to know that you've reached consensus, to know that you've made a decision. When you're in a room and you can all sort of go like this and say, "Does everyone agree?" You can see each other's eyes. You can understand what people are thinking. But when you're in a virtual environment like this, you have to look across a bunch of things. Sometimes you're doing things asynchronously. So be a little more mindful about how you think about talking to each other, how you think about recording the outcomes, how you think about documenting, not to the point of sort of the CYA kind of documenting, but just making it clear as a group what you've all come up with so that you can move forward and continue to work on that asynchronous basis.
I'll let you keep that acronym, an acronym.
And I think what we really ought to do is move on to the next slide and see if we have any questions that people would like to raise. There was one earlier on that I did capture. Someone asked, and I'm sorry I didn't capture the name, has anyone looked at the system economics of virtual work versus physical? The carbon footprint of the technology, the sort of the trade-off between brick and mortar buildings and people working from their homes. I don't know if we have any specific data on that. Kate, do you have anything?
There are some studies that look at that, and I can share them. I would tell people right now, if you're interested, the Sloan Management Review is open today. It was open for 3 days, and that's it. This is the last day. And if you go to the top, you'll see that they've got a list of articles on virtual work. Many of them actually have economic factors. Also, Chris, if you could anonymize the work, I mean, you're obviously not going to anonymize it. You said it was nuance, but if you could share with us.
It was a public case study, yeah.
If you could share that case study with the group, we can include it in our resources that we're going to be providing for these participants.
Yeah, and I threw this in the chat window as well. Microsoft has already made announcements that we're going to be not just carbon neutral, but carbon negative by 2030. So Microsoft, as part of our commitment, is not only going to, again, neutralize our impact on what's going on with the environment, but also remove all the carbon we've put in since the company was founded back in the 1970s. So it's a very public case study. We're putting billions of dollars behind it. And again, so this is, again, what Microsoft is doing. I can't speak to what Google and Amazon and other cloud providers are doing, but I can speak to what Microsoft is doing. And Satya Nadella, our CEO, again, as our ongoing CEO Connections regularly talks about what Microsoft is doing to be a better corporate citizen as more and more of you put your data into the Microsoft cloud. And again, I'll let the other cloud providers speak to what they're doing.
Yeah, and I would just argue that right at this point in time, in addition to the economics, there's a second driver, which is you have a huge portion of the workforce coming, whether we're talking about folks on the more mature side of their careers who have established reputations with their companies, but they're asking for flexibility in their work hours just because commutes have gotten so terrible, or they want to pick where they live as opposed to having to be tied to a location because of a corporate headquarters. And then you also have new folks coming into the workforce who are new in their careers that are asking for more flexibility because that's a value for them. And so you've got a lot of pressure on corporations, on organizations in general right now to look at flexible work arrangements as a quality of life issue, whether it's related to commutes in terrible commutes in urban areas, or whether it's just a philosophical question because somebody is looking at things from an environmental and a carbon footprint perspective. So there's a big shift in terms of how people are thinking about it.
I think there's been an evolution of work over the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years. I used to always, as a consultant, I always used to have to go and sit somewhere. I used to work on a project with Marianne, and I would sit outside her desk or outside her office. But I think over the last 5 or 10 years, people have become more comfortable with working with people who are somewhere else because we can focus on the outcomes as opposed to the day-to-day process. If I take 5 minutes off to go down and pick up my dry cleaning, it doesn't matter if I've finished my task. At our company, at Praxis, we actually have a couple people who work from other locations in the summer, for example. If they want to go and live in Iceland, or Derek Cash Peterson lived in Iceland last summer, and he was working on projects with us. And, frankly, it didn't make any difference at all because we are all used to working virtually, but we practice that. We do it all the time. And when we understand the cues and we understand how the interactions need to work in order to make things, in order to keep things productive. So I think it does take some practice. I think some people are better at working from home or working remotely than others are. And it is a learned set of skills, so it's not something where you just sort of flip a switch like we've had to do this in this last couple of weeks and expect that everyone can be good at it.
And I think that's particularly important. Mark is talking about it in terms of, ironically, he and I started out working in a co-located situation where we had physical, contact, and yet we've transitioned into this new environment for a very long time. But I think even when we were sitting locally, we were still working with virtual teams, and one of the things we learned in those environments allowed us to be able to fully transition to fully remote positions and to be able to do that extremely effectively. But I think part of what you have to think about is this is talking about becoming a global citizen. And, whether we're talking about how to set yourself up to be able to be an effective meeting organizer, a meeting host, and meeting moderator, now you're doing it with groups of people that may or may not be sitting on multiple continents. They might speak multiple languages. They're sitting in multiple time zones. And so these are additional layers of nuance that have to be taken into consideration if you want to get the respect of your team, because time zones can become a power play now. And how you set your multilingual participants up to be able to participate by doing things proactively is something that you have to actively think about.
Cool.
There was one other question I wanted to just make sure that we hit, and then we may run a couple minutes over. Andrea asked, a lot of project managers or folks who aren't necessarily so great with the technology are used to people in their office maybe being able to help, sort of stop by, hey, could you help me figure this out? Has anyone noticed a trend in the last few weeks or even the last few years toward webinars to do some of the basic stuff? I think I have. And I think there's a lot more video content out there. There's a lot more. I know with the PNP, the Patterns and Practices effort, which is an external group of people who assist with some of the open source efforts outside of Microsoft. There are some people starting up some very basic stuff like how do you use GitHub, how do you use Visual Studio Code. Those are techie things, but at the same time, there are videos out there about how to use Excel. There are videos out there about how to use Teams. So I think we're seeing more and more and more of that content, and good content, not just the some kids sitting in their basement kind of stuff. It's actually very high quality stuff, and they're also paid services, of course, like Pluralsight and is it still called Lynda? No, it's LinkedIn.
LinkedIn Learning. Yeah, Microsoft owns them. Yeah, so we had to rebrand them.
There are lots of options.
Yeah, Mark, we're going to include a bunch of the resources there from folks at Caruana on the Teams adoption team that have been putting out some really, what I think is high quality training content, really this scenario-based, persona-based, role-based as well. So we're going to share a bunch of that in the resources that we're going to package up as well.
Yeah, and I think part of this, Mark, is just to move to we just as you have citizens journalism, now you have citizen content creation, right? And people started doing it out of necessity because they weren't connected to their organizations anymore, which means they had to become their own IT department. They had to become their own training department. They had to become their own HR department. So suddenly you needed to be able to find that kind of information. And then you got the second piece of that, which is it's never been more cost effective, never been easier, or just more of an option to be able to create high quality content.
I think we're going to have to wrap it up at this point, right? Let me just very, very quick, 30 seconds. You know, we're sort of doing this under the umbrella of the Teams Thursday event that we're, again, hoping to hold on June 3rd. It's postponed from April 2nd. We'll see how the world goes. We hope that if you found this interesting, you would join us on that day, because I think it's actually on a Wednesday. This is what happens when you have to reschedule things. More of the same topics, a lot more depth, a lot more a lot more of things about how technically do you do things in Teams. There were a lot of questions about that, for example. And then finally, the last slide there. I think that I want to make sure that everyone knows we've got 2 more of these webinars coming up, at least so far. Clinic number 2 and 3. Virtual events and virtual brainstorming. I'll use the abbreviation. I would encourage you to sign up for those if you found this useful. Which is what the screenshot is, to sign up for additional clinics at Eventbrite. And then we're going to post all of the resources that we've talked about or that have come up in this hour on that link right there, which is the Teams Thursday New England website, and there's a page for webinars. So if you go to that page, then we'll make sure that you can get to any of the resources that we have coming out of this. So thanks a lot for joining us. I hope you all gained something from this. It's a tricky time. We know that we're all thinking about work a little bit differently, and hopefully we brought you some perspectives that you may not have had yet. We're all learning as we go, though, so make sure that you know that there are communities like this who are out here to try and help you. We're all in this together, and make sure you reach out and take advantage of what a great community this technology is.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.